Honestly, I think it's because mummies aren't sexy. It's really easy to make a scary and sexy vampire movie. Even like things like Jekyll and Hyde have a kind of, I've always said it has a kind of homoerotic tension to it. But mummies,
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Resurrectionists podcast. This week, we are joined by Dr. J. Sullivan. Dr. Sullivan has a master's degree in Victorian studies from Birkbeck University of London, a PhD in English literature from University of Roehampton. She is the author of Egyptian Gothic, 1884 to 1920, and she also works as a digital expert specializing in public and heritage organizations and has developed websites and social media strategies for London Fire Brigade, the Natural History Museum, and the Royal Air Force Museum. So welcome to the show, Dr. Sullivan.
thank you. That was lovely.
So I was so fascinated when you reached out because I am a fan of Victorian things. I am a fan of Egyptian things. I am a fan of Gothic things. I've never heard of the Egyptian Gothic until I read your book. Dr. Sullivan has an amazing book, which I will, of course, link in the bio below. So can you give us a little introduction? What is the Egyptian Gothic?
Of course I can. So, as you said, it is the perfect blend of Victorian things, Egyptian things, and spooky things. So, without too much historical background, as I'm sure we'll get into that, the Victorians were weirdly obsessed with Egypt. And while this did translate into things you might expect, like museum displays or Egyptian-style designs, they also wrote a huge number of spooky stories about mummies and cursed objects and mummy wheat found in tombs that they decided to grow. And these objects would come back, turn malignant, and track them down, essentially. And these stories are essentially an embodiment of that anxiety around looting artifacts and Egyptian bodies from Egypt. It's very strange. It happened in a very short period of time. So my book covers 1884 to 1920, which is roughly the period these stories exploded. And when I say exploded, I mean, really, we're talking about 50 stories in a short period. For comparison, around 20 vampire stories happened at the same time. So this really was the monster of the week in a way that I guess zombies were for a hot minute about a decade ago. So these Victorian stories, wildly popular, everywhere. They're in periodicals, they're novels, and then bam, they just vanish out of nowhere. So it's a real hot flash trend. And I think that's what makes it interesting. You get these spooky stories, and they're so intense, and they're so popular, and they're so readable, and then they're gone, and now they're mostly out of print, so they're quite forgotten today, which, I mean, I think is very sad, obviously, as I wrote a whole book about it, but they're really interesting. They really capture a period of time, and they really bottle up all this anxiety, and then they use that to create delightful horror stories, which, I mean, we're recording this on the week of Halloween, and I think that's delightful to talk about that at this time.
Mm-hmm. I think, like, as I was reading through your book, one of the things I kind of, because I presumed I'd never read an Egyptian Gothic story. I don't think I have. But as I was reading through it and learning about the different themes that go into them, I'm like, I've definitely seen movies that I feel like are probably based off of these stories now. Like The Mummy comes to mind as like a prime example of like a lot of the different themes you hit on in the book. And I was like, okay, so that makes sense. I've just never heard of like there being books that predated the movies that were this like, what, 60-year, 70, 80-year trend and then vanished as well?
Yeah, it's definitely, I guess, kind of proto-cinema. So, spoiler alert, the conclusion of my book does end with the introduction of the Mummy movie. And I can definitely say that these stories are proto-cinematic. What's really interesting about them is there's so many instances of the senses. So mummies touch back, they reach through time, they reach through the museum glass. There's stories about weird smells that terrorize tomb raiders. There's all kinds of things. People taste the mummy. They drink from the wine from the mummy's tomb. All kinds of crazy things happen. And in a way, I do think it's an early run for the cinema. The same way that when you're sat and you're watching the 1999 Mummy in surround sound, which of course you are, it really takes over, and you have that skin crawling body horror of beetles crawling all over you. And that's in the Egyptian Gothic, sorry to creep you out, but a good 110 years before. And that's really exciting to me and other Victorian nerds, I'm sure. Yeah, they are real body horror. It's very interesting that a lot of things we now see in cinema, there was an early run here. And I do think it kind of fizzled out. There's some political reasons why it fizzled out, but also because the novel and the page can't compete with the cinema. And like when you're watching a film, it's showing you how you should feel. It is overwhelming you with sound and visual spectacle. And a dusty 20-page story can't do that. I mean, I love them dearly, but it can't. Yeah, I do think there's definitely a lot of links.
Yeah, I feel like a story relies very much on the reader's imagination, whereas, as you said with the Beatles, like, I don't need to imagine what that feels like. I can feel that on me. The sound is making me feel it on me. So
no, definitely.
What was it?
Go. No, go.
No, I was just going to say, what was it that drew you to Gothic literature specifically, and then obviously that led into Egyptian Gothic literature?
I mean, Gothic in general, what drew me to that was probably a combination of, and this is going to really age me to a specific place and time, reading Terry Deary's horrible histories, specifically the Victorian and the Egyptian ones. I had an Egyptian one where you could scratch the front cover and then you could like smell how Egypt was meant to smell, and it would have like disgusting things in it, like yeah, it was great. I need to track one down. I mean, all of the things really smelled the same, but it was that there's that formulaic historical knowledge, and then I was one of them weird only children who like wanted to be Anne Boleyn, so that doesn't help either. Great start. And combined with that, the only child thing comes into play again, because my mum would be like, just read this. So I ended up reading like James Herbert at 9. And I just think it broke me internally and created this academic interest in both history and the weird. So it's one of them. The formulation was there. Like, it's been in my DNA since I was a child. And then I had what I would say was quite a miserable job in insurance that I really hated. And I was like, I need to get out of here. So I need to get out. And I started doing a Birkbeck degree in the evening in Victorian literature. Do want to take a moment to shout out Birkbeck, because they do great evening classes. So you don't have to take 2 years out of your life to do an MA. You can do it in the evening. Excellent. And you can access like UCL libraries 10 out of 10. So I did that. And one of the modules was the Victorian Supernatural. And they had one text. It was Jewel of Seven Stars on the reading list. I just read it and it all clicked. I was like, this is fascinating. I want to read more about this. And then it just didn't go. I wrote a whole essay on it for MA and it didn't sell. And so I ended up doing a PhD, which I think is the way that people end up doing PhDs, isn't it? You have like a brain itch that won't scratch. And instead of being normal about it and maybe just finding another hobby, you end up spending 6 years doing a PhD and making it your life.
Well, that is what they say. If you can't love it in the worst moments of your life for the next 4 years, don't do it, because it will kill you.
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, it's the same with MA level study. I think any kind of further education like that, you've got to really love it or it will kill you. It's one of them, isn't it? You need to really have that passion.
Definitely, especially like at MA level, you're not getting paid anything to do that. Right. So you better be loving it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, really, you're paying 10 grand for the privilege of learning something that you're obsessed with. So yeah, you better suck it up. It's an expensive mistake otherwise. I'm sure that's not the slogan that any university uses for their MA program. But they probably don't want that one, but it's true.
Very true. So what is it, do you think, that has the Victorians so obsessed with Egypt? Because when I think of like ancient Egypt, I always think of it in two periods. The ancient Egyptian period, where it was contemporary, everything existed back then. But then when I think of it, I also associate it with the Victorians in particular. Like they're just intertwined in a way that I feel like ancient Egypt is intertwined in all periods. You know, it's influenced so many, but the Victorians in particular. So why is it, do you think, the Victorians were so obsessed with Egypt?
So I think there's two things here. One is some very loose commonalities between the Victorian period and the Egyptian period. And really, when the Victorians are talking about the Egyptian period, they're talking about the late Egyptian period, like Cleopatra and that kind of period. So I've just said periods so many times. But they tend to link Queen Victoria with Cleopatra, the idea of this great female ruler, this powerful presence, and on the flip side of that, because you can't think of Cleopatra without thinking about how she died, that idea that the great empire is on the precipice of crumbling. And the Victorians were also super obsessed with the Roman Empire for the exact same reason. It's a very what goes up must come down thing. And these stories, they're taking place from sort of 1884 onwards. And you think like the Victorian period shift to Edwardian around 1900s. So they've really got the sense that, like all great empires, the Victorian reach is crumbling. And so I think they find identification in Egypt. So that's one reason. The other reason is, let's be honest, Egyptian stuff looks cool. The Victorians are very aesthetic people. They love their decadence, like pre-Raphaelite art, medievalism. They love a bit of aesthetic flair. Victorian homes, if you're rich, obviously, are not calm. They're not minimalist. They are stuff on stuff on stuff. And so I think that kind of Egyptian tomb finery and glory, that really appeals to them. And then the third reason, I'm aware there's a lot of reasons here, but I don't think there's one straightforward answer, is that they spent a chunky amount of time looting Egyptian tombs and taking them back to display. And I mean, we think of museums here. I mean, even this week with the big Napoleon jewelry theft, the joke that you'll find it in the British Museum. I mean, it's a well-timed joke, but it's true. There's a lot of theft into museums, but also into private homes, kind of home museums and cabinets of curiosities. And while in the period I'm writing about, they had tightened up the law on exporting Egyptian antiquities, really it made no difference. It was very much, if you couldn't get a whole mummy home, you would snap off a hand or a foot and take that with you. They would take grave goods that were wrapped in bandages, jewelry, anything they could get their mitts on, really. And I do think that kind of grave robbing, because that's what it is, it manifests in this imperial guilt, and then that festers into the Gothic, as that's how the Gothic works. So it's a really interesting way that they manifest the body and the things they're doing into something that comes back to get them. So I do think, even though people were doing this and they were doing it quite freely, they obviously weren't that comfortable deep down about it, because, I mean, it is grave robbing. So I do think that's why there's so many stories about people stealing necklaces and rings and it going malignant. The good example here is Louisa May Alcott has the Little Women lady. Who would have known? She has a story called Lost in the Pyramid, and they take mummy wheat from a tomb and they grow it and it forms a beautiful flower, and they decide they're going to wear this flower on their wedding dress on their wedding day, and the dear lady at the tail drops dead on her wedding day. And there's this kind of loop of vengeance from stolen goods. And that happens throughout the Egyptian Gothic. It's a really common trope. So I do think that's another reason there's so much interest in it and yet unease at the same time. That was a long answer. I hope I paused for breath at some point.
It's a very good answer. And it just dawned on me as you were saying, like, they were grave robbing, that, like, this is coinciding as well with peak in grave robbing of Victorian graves for like anatomical practices as well. So I guess it kind of makes sense that they are having this retrospective, like, "Ooh, I stole that thing from Egypt, and maybe that wasn't good because I don't want myself being stolen."
No, it is the classic. How long is it before it stops being grave robbing and starts being archaeology? And they're definitely wrestling with this, 100%. But then there's also a bit of imperialism in this as well. They don't see much comparison between Egyptian remains, which are distinctly not white British, and British remains, which apparently are completely different, even though that is not the case at all.
Mm. Yeah. So, do you think that it's this kind of general interest in Egyptian culture that means that there are more Egyptian Gothic novels at the time compared to, like you said earlier, like vampire novels? Or is there something else playing into it as to why? Because vampire is the one that, like, when I think Victorian Gothic novels, I think Dracula or like Frankenstein. I couldn't come up with a mummy one. Yeah. So what is it, do you think, that meant that Egyptians were like, the Egyptian Gothic was bigger than the genres we would think of as Gothic novels?
I think, to be honest, there's a lot of reasons at play here. And a lot of it is to do with the increase in tourism. So, my decades are not great because my notes aren't with me. But we're going to say 1860, and everyone can tell me I'm wrong in the comments. But I think around 1860, Thomas Cook introduced package tours to Egypt, and it was much easier to travel there now. Now, assuming you've got money, of course. Everyone I'm talking about today has money. This is not working class Egyptian Gothic. They may have read these texts, but they're definitely not the ones looting things overseas. So, but if you were rich enough to afford a Thomas Cook package holiday, you didn't have to think about anything. They would take you out there. They would ferry you up and down the Nile. You would not have to interact with the locals that you thought were beneath you. You could chill at the Shepherd's Hotel, was the popular one. It's actually apparently still exists in Egypt. It's under renovation if you would like to live your 1880 Gothic fantasy. But it was much easier to, yeah, of course, who wouldn't? It's much easier to visit Egypt. It's much easier to have access to antiquities. And there's a couple of really good texts about it. I'll send like a little reading list. But these tourists were a nightmare. You think about TikToks now talking about tourist behavior in other countries, but they weren't any better. They were chiseling their names into the pyramid. They were like snapping off bits of mummy hand and taking them home. And I do think this increased travel to Egypt, it creates increased interest as well. And at the same time, we illegally occupied Egypt. So in 1884, which is the moment my book starts, we illegally occupied Egypt so we could take control of the Suez Canal. And I'm sure listeners here do not want to hear the deep geopolitical background to this, but essentially it was for trade. It meant that we didn't have to sail all the way around South Africa to get to India and China. We could just go straight through. So it was very important. And while we were doing this illegal occupation, because that's 100% what it was, all of these stories start popping up. So I do think it's a response to increased tourism and familiarity, but also the political circumstances were happening at the same time. I feel like people weren't comfortable with what was happening. And often when the status quo says that empire is good and empire is great, but the stories are saying otherwise, they're showing terrible things happen from this. And to give an example on this, you spoke about Dracula. So now, I mean, yeah, Dracula is the quintessential horror novel. I mean, if you think about anything that's been published in the last 150 years, Dracula comes straight up there. But the year that was published, a book by a guy called Richard Marsh, The Beetle, was published. And The Beetle is also from multiple perspectives, 4 different people, 4 main characters. And it's about a shape-shifting beetle creature which pursues people across London, across Egypt, because it has a vendetta against a politician. It's an absolutely insane novel. At the end of it, the beetle gets squashed in a train car accident and becomes kind of beetle jam, and everyone moves on with their lives. But there's just it's a very strange novel. It's available on Penguin Classics. You can pick it up easy. But it it has stuff like a white woman being laid on a slab and eaten alive while a guy screams and watches on. It has all kinds of weird things. They like kidnap a woman and shave her head and force her to wear rags. It's all kinds of really strange things. And it's a vengeance story, essentially, about a politician who has a jolly to Egypt and goes where he shouldn't and how it comes back to bite him. And that was more popular than Dracula. It outsold it by 4 times. It was huge. And now, I mean, I recommend you read it because I think it's delightfully batshit. But if you read the two together now, you would be like, why was this one so much popular than Dracula? Like, the beat was not really taught at school level, but Dracula definitely never goes off that Gothic literature list. And they're very similar. It's very strange. And they both have quite similar anxieties. So, yeah, it was hugely popular. I really can't underestimate how much people enjoyed reading these stories. And even famous authors like Arthur Conan Doyle would have like a bash at one. Everyone sort of seemed to turn their hand to it at some point. Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula, also has an Egyptian Gothic novel called Jewel of Seven Stars, which is mostly forgotten, but was turned into, talking about that cinematic again, it was turned into a Hammer horror in the mid-60s, which is very like blood and gore and boobs, and has really like played down the Egyptian Gothic elements and played up the like sexy Egyptian stuff. Which I guess rightly so, jazz it up. Why not?
Why is it, do you think, that those, like you're saying with Dracula or the big kind of Gothic novels that we still teach today, that everyone, whether you've read them or not, could name today, why do you think those have stayed in the popular culture, have been turned into movies over and over again, have been read in school over and over again, and then almost, it seems, none of the Egyptian mummy ones have?
Honestly, I think it's because mummies aren't sexy. It's really easy to make a scary and sexy vampire movie. Even like things like Jekyll and Hyde have a kind of, I always say it has a kind of homoerotic tension to it. But mummies, I think when we think of them now, we think of like the Scooby-Doo mummy, like wrapped in toilet roll and moving really slowly. And it's really hard to shake that image. The 1999 mummy does a good job of it, I'd say. And of course, the original mummy is also a bit of a slow shuffling toilet roll mummy. And that's the problem. I do think that image has dominated so much. Like, when you think of the mummy, you think of it like hands outstretched, reaching for you. Yeah, toilet roll, trailing, making like a weird moaning noise. And these stories, they're nothing like that. Like even like Lot Number 249 by Arthur Conan Doyle, the mummy is fast, it's wiry. They describe it as tiger-like. So I do think even the female mummies, they don't have that kind of Cleopatra-esque eroticism we might expect from the cinema. They're often turn into dust and vanish when the protagonist goes to kiss them or something like that. So I just think it is really, really hard to sex up mummies. I can't believe that's a sentence that just left my mouth. But I do genuinely think that is what it is. They're so odd and quirky. Kind of in the way that if you read Frankenstein and you've only seen a Frankenstein movie, it's a wildly different novel. It's basically just a guy in the Arctic pondering his life. And you're like, what? So I do think it's that kind of slow pace of the Victorian novel. Often the cinema pulls out the best bits. And then when you come to the source material, you're like, what is this? And it's definitely that. I feel like it's very hard to translate these to a modern audience because they're so odd.
That definitely makes sense, because I have tried, nobody kill me for this, I've tried to read Dracula a few times and I can't finish it. It's so long and nothing happens for so much of it.
Yeah, I mean, a large amount of it was Bram Stoker researching timetables in Romania for trains so that he could get like hyper accurate train journeys. Like, don't get me wrong, I love Dracula because, of course, I do. But it is mostly just people writing letters and taking the train, which is a very Jane Austen-y kind of plot, where nothing really happens, and then suddenly it all kicks off. But yeah, it's very much that, and just like the Beetle, really, because it has multiple narrators. Every time you start to get into it, it swaps perspective and it kills the pace. I don't think Victorian authors really understand pacing in the same way we do today. They could really do with maybe like a Netflix special kind of lesson on how to drag things out.
Yeah, definitely. So, as I was reading through your book, I noticed that like one of the big things you were talking about was sort of the five senses and how they
Mhm.
relate to the Egyptian Gothic. So
Mhm.
is this your way of studying it, or is this kind of the intentional way that they were putting into the writings as well?
I definitely don't think it was intentional. I found that it was a good way to, I'm going to use the classic pun, but it was a good way to unwrap so much source material, or maybe wrap so much source material, I guess. In so many mummy puns, so little time. But it's one of them where, as I was reading it, I was just struck time and time again by how this material is so, yeah, like bodily. And that wasn't just disgust either, which you would expect from horror novels. You expect them to be disgusting, you expect them to make your skin crawl. But there was weird things in there, like musical mummies who could magically play instruments beautifully, or there's stories about haunted ancient music that hypnotizes people and takes over their senses, which I thought was really strange. And then there would be things like, yeah, flowers that when they bloom, they smell of blood, or people hypnotized by. There's lots of talk about mesmeric hypnotic sense of the tomb and how it takes control of your will. And I thought it was really interesting. These things come up time and time again. So when I came to write this book, I break it down by, yeah, touch, sight, sound, and smell. And then I found there wasn't that much on taste. And I think that's because previously people ate mummies, but at the end of the Victorian period, they were moving away from this. So I actually think they kind of like X the taste because it was a bit too close to home. So I use my conclusion to talk a bit more about like taste in objects and like aesthetic taste instead of literal. But yeah, it's a very strange thing. It is completely full of sensory descriptions. And yeah, it's not sensation fiction. This isn't like Lady Audley's Secret, like page turnery things. It's just bizarrely pungent. Some of the stories are incredibly smelly to read. Really, they need a scratch and sniff element, like one of them Terry Deary books. In fact, maybe I should do that. Penguin, if you want to hit me up, let me know. I will sort that out. But yeah, it's a really interesting way to tackle it. And I think there's been a lot of work on the senses in literature, but maybe not looking at one genre and with this kind of lens. So an interesting approach. At times, it drove me crazy because I had created a structure that I had to fit to, and it meant that lots of great stories got left out because I was just being like, and then they touched them again. And that was, for ease of reading, I just had to cut a lot of stuff out. It could easily have been double that length, but I was like, it must be readable or people will hate me forever. Um, but yeah, there's lots of it. The book is just the top level, and underneath there's a whole sensory world as well that couldn't quite be squashed in.
I know as well that you were discussing obviously the senses and how it relates to people used to be able to actually touch the mummies in the
Yeah.
museums or have a they weren't behind glass necessarily like they are now. So is that also playing a part in the descriptions of the senses in the books as well?
Oh, 100%. So, for context, for people who aren't going to read the book, and you should, but that's okay. I'm here to talk at you, um, with you, at you, either way. Um, but yeah, before sort of the Victorian period, I would say sort of late Georgian, museums were very much a free for all. And that's because they were only allowed access to the rich. So if you were rich enough, you could just put your calling card in and be like, oh, yeah, Sir Reginald Esquire is coming to visit on the 18th of November. And they would just let you in the Tower of London and you could pick stuff up. You could root through drawers. You could take your time. Same with the British Museum collection. You were able to view that. And then as it was open to the public, there was a general sense that that couldn't go on, and the disgusting general public can't be trusted with that. And that's when you start to get security guards. When you first went to the British Museum, as it was open to visitors, you would be led on a guided tour, and there was lots of complaints that people weren't allowed to stop and look and enjoy things, because the guard was like, on to the next room, it's massive, we've got to get through. So it was a very different experience. And then as you get the modern museum experience that we have today, where we think of like glass boxes and signage and security guards watching you at all times, that kind of thing, it enters more like a prisonscape, really, like a panopticon, where you'll find many museums, and I challenge you to have a look next time you go to one. You'll find that they have galleries that are designed for surveillance, or they're in the round, so that wherever you are, you can be viewed by others. Maybe not so at your like local council museum where it's just in one room, but often there's a sense that you can't be alone with the objects. And I think that and I just look at Egypt, but I reckon you could apply it to many other collections, and there's a whole PhD project out there. Someone go grab it, I beg you. But this idea that if you can't touch the thing you desire, you can't engage with it on a bodily level, because people do. Humans want to touch things. Even if you don't think you do, people do. They have to touch things. They have to like feel it to get confirmation. So I think when that is blocked, it creates a whole imaginative landscape, and you find that people create stories about objects. So while I talk about the Egyptian Gothic genre, the real world of interest in Egypt artifacts, it was a whole explosion. There's a group of people called the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, who are essentially an Egypt-influenced cult, and they would go to the British Museum and meditate in front of the objects and say they're like convening with ancient Egyptians, which I'm sure is really odd for the security staff on duty while there's someone sat there for 7 hours meditating. Or they would hang out in the British Library reading rooms and find like-minded types. So there's a whole imaginative world here, and it's not just the stories, but also people in reality. So yeah, I would argue that if you put things behind glass, if you deny touch, it does allow people to take from objects in other ways. And sometimes that's crime. Sometimes they steal the objects, but sometimes they engage with them.
Yeah. And I noticed as well that in your book, you're talking a lot about not just how people interact with mummies, but like different parts of Egyptian culture as well. Like they take on the symbolism, they take on, some of the deities, naming temples after deities and things like that. But then you also mentioned that they have very little regard for the Egyptian people who were living during the Victorian period in Egypt. To them, it's all ancient Egypt. It's not contemporary to them, Egypt. So is there like this level of sort of, it seems like cultural appropriation going on, where they're like taking the parts that they deem to be upscale and abandoning the parts that they don't want to look at as well?
No, definitely. And when I guess we say abandoning the parts, it's often literally the people. So I looked at British Museum guidebooks that said that by looking at parts of ancient Egyptians, you can definitively conclude that they were actually white, which is crazy. But yeah, even up until 1912, these guidebooks are insisting that ancient Egyptians are actually descended from white European people, and therefore the people living in Egypt today, or today 150 years ago, had absolutely no bearing on people who produced these great works. They wouldn't have been capable of doing it. So there's a real element of not just taking on the trappings of their gods and their beliefs and their aesthetics, but also disavowing it to the point that there's no link between the Egyptians today. They're a different class of people, which, I mean, it's completely wild to me. I'm like, that's not how, I mean, you're an archaeologist. That's absolutely not how it works. That's basic anything, really, basic science. So there's real elements of that, which I find quite shocking. I would say that even though I do delight in these tales and I think they're wonderful, you really do have to strap yourself in for old-timey racism, because there's plenty of it in there, and it's very sad. I do always say that even though I called the book Egyptian Gothic for readability, within the book, I tend to try and refer to it as the Egyptianized Gothic, because this is text by Victorian people about this imagined Egypt where they've absorbed all the trappings and created something that's both beautiful and evil. It doesn't have any, it's not written by Egyptians in Egypt of the period. And a lot of the descriptions of Egyptians of the period are quite repulsive and disgusting, which makes for quite unpleasant reading. I'm pleased to say that now there are Egyptians working today, writing back against empire in this way, creating their own Egyptian Gothic tales, which is really delightful. But the ones of this period is definitely an imagined space of Egypt, where they've picked the bits that suit them and discard the bits that don't.
So you were saying as well that a lot of these stories kind of play into the theme of revenge, or, you know, someone's stolen these artifacts, so something terrible happens to them kind of thing. Do you think this also plays into that idea of like empire over Egypt as well? Is that one of the themes that's kind of being played against in these books as well?
Definitely. There's really strong links between empire and Egypt. And I mean, I spoke earlier about how the Victorians kind of felt a sympathy and a connection to ancient Egypt. Maybe it was aspirational to them, but at the same time, a source of anxiety because all great empires fall. But I do think these stories are a way to map domination on Egypt as well. And that especially comes up in stories about female mummies. So you'll have stories where they'll discover a mummy, and conveniently, the female ones are always perfectly preserved and they still look stunning and they're not what you think a mummy looks like. And there'll be a scene where they'll unwrap them. And this is essentially a very heavy-handed sexual assault metaphor. And I do think a lot of that is another way of dominating. So instead of taking objects, taking people. And the mummy's an interesting one to map that on because, of course, a mummy is both an object and a person. It's really, they're a person. But there's this idea that if you can dominate the mummy and take control of that body, if you put it in display in the museum, it becomes an object. So I do think there's an element of, establishing domination over another empire. And these stories often do that through the body. There'll be a moment where they'll, unwrap the mummy, or there's also a subgenre here of mummy romances, where instead of trying to be killed by the mummy, they want to kiss it. And often when that happens, the mummy crumbles to dust and nopes out of existence, which thwarts that threat. Thankfully, because I don't want to read mummy porn. Thank you. It's not for me. I'm sure it's out there on the internet, but it's not something I'm interested in. Please don't send it to me. So there is that as well. It's a very strange thing where there's so many ways in which they try and take control of these Egyptian artifacts, and I would say by extension, the troublesome Egypt that they're having problems with in the present day, is a very strange way of playing it out, and I'm sure that it's subconscious. I really don't think that anyone sat down and was like, let's work out my twisty feelings about the occupation of Egypt and the body and how I feel about exporting artifacts to the British Museum, and then produced a mummy revenge horror. I just don't think that's how it was working. But there's definitely a lot of subconscious feelings playing out. And I think that is how horror works, isn't it? The author will take their horrible, horrible feelings about an everyday issue and then push it to their most terrifying, murderous conclusion. And that's definitely happening here.
Yeah, it's very much, I feel I've heard someone say before that horror is like a reflection on society, like to the extreme. Mm-hmm. Is like the best horror of the period is like taking something that's actually happening and then just putting it to the extreme.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to talk about cinema again, I don't know why I talk about so much about cinema when I write on literature, but I mean, the world outside is an absolute shit show, but it's a wonderful time for horror. There's so many good films coming out. There's so many good novels coming out. And I do think it is that classic dark mirror to what's going on. And the Victorians are doing that too. They're definitely working out their sort of squirmy discomfort feelings about the end of the Victorian period. And this kind of idea that the empire's at its greatest point and it can only go down is definitely working its way out in these stories.
And do you think that plays into why these stories end all of a sudden as well? So your book is 1884 to 1920s because they end in the 1920s. Is this one of the reasons why? What's playing into that?
There's a couple of reasons I ended in 1920. So first I want to say that like it doesn't dead stop. There's still a couple after that, but this explosion of stories really does end there. And the 1920 is the year that the occupation of Egypt ends and they regain some form of independence. But also, it's an interesting thing because you would think that it would fizzle out during World War One, but it doesn't. Even with paper rationing, they're still chucking out four or so of these stories a year. And then 2 years later, after these stories have already fizzled out, and 2 years later is when Tutankhamun's tomb is discovered, and then that completely changes once again how people think about Egypt. And I do think that discovery of that tomb and that real life curse tale that came out of that opens a new chapter in how we think about mummies in Egypt and curse tales and retribution. And it kind of shuts off all breathing room for this kind of genre. It seems a bit twee when there's like a real life curse tale happening before your eyes. But yeah, they're not completely done. Agatha Christie writes one, and so does H.P. Lovecraft. But he Harry Houdini publishes it, but H.P. Lovecraft actually wrote it. So there are a few happening. And even I say today, I mean, I just as if I'm talking about the modern period, but I actually mean the 80s. There's a horror fiction called Obelisk that's set in New York, which is written by an American Egyptian author, and Anne Rice as well. She's got a trilogy called Ramesses the Damned, which is very Egyptian Gothic inspired. It's often overlooked because, I mean, Vampire Chronicles is much more famous. But they do trickle on into the present day. There are dribs and drabs, but I do think that the end of the occupation, followed by Tutankhamun, followed by the Mummy in cinema, really kills this off. With that, there's no more space for these they're slightly hokey, you know? And I don't think there's much more space for that when these things reshape how we think and see mummies. There's no room for them shape-shifting beetle creatures. They're just a bit silly, you know?
Yeah. I mean, I've definitely seen some modern horror movies that sound a lot like your Beatles story. I'm not saying they were inspired. I'm just saying we still do hooky, weird horror stories.
No, 100%. And a lot of these stories, I think, would live on well in our love for horror anthology series today. I think they could be redone. I mean, Mark Gatiss chose Lot Number 249 for his Christmas horror, and I was like, yes. And he used dialogue from the short story. Love that. But definitely, some of them are a bit campy and silly. And I wonder if they're maybe too silly to be scary. And yeah, it's one of those, isn't it, where we don't have those anxiety. I mean, we have many anxieties about Britain in general, but empire is over. And I think they're so entrenched with anxieties about empire and the current state of things in 1880 that they just don't carry on into the present day.
That makes sense. So we've obviously discussed how it's played into horror, both on the page and on screen into the modern era. But are we also seeing echoes of the Egyptian Gothic in other areas, like in museums or dark tourism sites or, true crime sort of settings? Or is it just a solely sort of page and screen setting that we see it?
I do think that dark tourism definitely feeds into the idea of the mummy's curse. And you think about sites in London like Cleopatra's Needle, where it's apparently a famous ghostly suicide spot. That was recognized even in this genre. One of these novels, Pharaohs the Egyptian, the opening scene takes place by Cleopatra's Needle. So I do think it feeds into that. And I often think that when we visit museums and we look at mummies, many people are doing that to look at a dead body. And I don't necessarily think they mean that in like a murder tourism kind of way. But I think in the present day, death in the Western world is mostly sequestered out of sight. People tend to die in hospitals and the hospice. You don't tend to encounter dead bodies, one would hope, on your day-to-day life. So I do think the mummy offers an opportunity to come face to face with death. And yes, sometimes people mean that in, like a ghoulish way, but often I think it's just innate human curiosity. And you'll find that some museum displays really feed into that. especially ones that aimed at children. Though I would say now, I mean, definitely in the last 10 years or so, museums have really started to think about whether they should display human remains, and a lot of places have really good dialogue and interpretation for people to think about when they go and visit these exhibits. It's definitely no longer like, come look at our weird mummy. Um, I mean, maybe some places, but um, not all. I do think things are much better, but it definitely plays into that. There's an element as well. I do think there's something almost magical about coming face to face with someone that's been preserved for thousands of years. And I know that we tend to find kinship with Egyptians, but that could be the same with bog bodies as well. This idea that something that should have been ashes to ashes, dust to dust is not. And I mean, as someone who deals with bones, I can assure you can understand that thrill of being able to
Yeah.
find something that's almost perfectly preserved by a miracle, really.
Yeah, I actually, as you were saying that, thought of bog bodies. I just took my friends to see
Yep.
the bog bodies in Dublin last week, and you do sort of get that like connection that even I don't get with skeletons, and I'm more familiar with skeletons than most people. There is something about like it's still being very much a person that like very much recognizable to anyone as a person that like is kind of way more jarring than just bones.
Yeah, there's the church in I mean, you will know its name, I'm sure, but there's that church in Dublin, isn't there, where there's mummies in the basement and they have fingernails still, like
Yeah.
perfectly preserved, and it is very uncanny. Even though you know that it's human remains, there is something almost spooky about it. I just think it sets off like a almost like a primal hair on the back of the neck response, being able to see something that is so old and still preserved so finely. So I do
Mm-hmm.
think, well, people do. Yeah, I don't really want to hesitate to label it dark tourism, but maybe morbid curiosity draws people to Egyptian artifacts. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think humans are naturally curious, and it is a good setting to come face to face with death as a mummy curses aren't real. And like, for all
Mm-hmm.
of the spookiness that surrounds them, they're just not. That's not how the ancient Egyptians worked. Um, so it's fine. I'm like, you can go stare at that mummy. It'll be fine. It won't follow you home.
Yeah, definitely. So, is there anything about your research? Well, I'm sure there's many things about your research that were interesting and surprising, but is there anything that sort of stands out as like a big like surprise or like something that you didn't realize going into it that
Um,
you're, you know?
yeah, definitely. The thing that this is always the way, isn't it? The thing that I found most interesting was the real life Egyptomania that was happening behind the scenes. And I find that that is the thing that always interests me is people and social history. And a lot of the authors were quite unusual people. For example, there was an author called Winifred Graham who wrote a story which is now sadly out of print. And she was an anti-Mormon activist who wrote 88 novels. And I'm like, wow, who is this lady? And then you go to look up, no more information. Oh, okay. There's a, a son and mother combo, the
Oh, wow.
Pritchards, who wrote an Egyptian short story together, which I thought was really cool, like a mum and son going into it. And then I did a bit more digging on them. And it turns out the son in World War II invented this attack plan where you would put dummy heads on sticks and raise them above the parapet to see where the fire was. So instead of losing people, they would put these dummy heads over. And I've seen pictures of them. They look ridiculous, quite frankly, but it's very cute. And I'm like, he was in charge of World War One strategy, and I'm like, when did you take a break from the trenches to call your mum and write a story? Um, so there was all of these really interesting authors, and at first you start with the famous ones, your Conan Doyle's, Bram Stoker, and you just keep digging. And so many of them, I got a real sense through their writing of like who they were as people. You get this real sense of sort of whimsy and fun. And I really love that. I did feel like I could reach through time almost and talk to these people through their writings. And it does make me wonder. I would love my classic, if you got a time machine, I would love to know
Okay.
how they felt that 150 years later, some poor woman spent 5 years of her life closely analysing the novel that they probably bashed out in the weekend. I would love to know. I'd love to know if it was intentional that they planned to write so much like smelly, noisy stuff. But I'm sure it wasn't. I'm sure they find it very odd. But I would love to know because and I'd love to have a pint with like most of those authors because backstories are crazy and I think they're really interesting.
I love that the authors are just as crazy as the stories they were writing.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something about the Victorians and they all had arsenic in their wallpaper and they're like drinking a lot of gin to lean into all of them Victorian stereotypes. There's a lot of sexual repression flying around and a lot of like opium smoke and stuff. And I just think it brought their brains entirely. Not all of them, of course. Some of them are like relentlessly, a little bit. I'm like, of course, some of them are relentlessly normie people. Like there's over 50 stories in that book. Like some of them are not interesting at all. But every now and then you like dig into the backstory and there's a real character in there.
So funny. Is there any sort of misconceptions that people have about Egyptian Gothic that you would want to set straight or, fix that's in the public mind? There are many, I know many things about many fields where people are like, if I could fix one thing, it's this.
I mean, the good thing about, I guess, my niche field is that nobody knows about it really. Okay, that there are a small number of very talented academics working in this space, but outside of academia, it's something that people don't really know. But I guess the one thing I really want to fix is that, there was a whole lively world of imaginative stories before the 1932 mummy. And like it didn't invent being terrified by mummies. There was a whole thing before that. That would be the one. And also maybe there's a story time. There's a mummy in the British Museum that is known as the unlucky mummy. It's apparently cursed. And it's not a mummy, it's a mummy board, the flat panel that went over the sarcophagus. So it's not even a mummy. So that's the weirdest curse of all. And there's this rumor that it sank the Titanic, which is frankly impossible because it was in the British Museum the whole time. But there's some kind of confusion because a journalist called W.T. Stead wrote about the mummy and he died on the Titanic. And I think through a convoluted game of telephone, they've just cut out the middleman and now the mummy sunk the Titanic. So that one comes up a lot. And whenever you Google like spooky museum stories or spooky Egyptian curse stories, that one about the unlucky mummy sinking the Titanic always pops up. And I'm like, it's not a damn mummy and it was in the museum the whole time. So please, no. Can't believe I'm defending the British Museum collections because that is not my forte. But genuinely, this one has done nothing wrong. It's one of them. And actually, the story behind it is quite interesting because the person who did steal it during the Sudan War was squashed by an elephant. He shot it, failed to kill it, and it kind of stepped on him into like a form of jam. And then apparently there was a huge storm which washed his remains away. So if anyone was a victim, I know. If anyone was a victim of a mummy curse, it was him. His name was Walter Ingram. And I mean, he sounds like an asshole because he like stole artifacts and shot elephants. So it's not really a curse. It's probably just karma. But it makes me laugh because that artifact, I said, it has a whole other life about the Titanic, but its actual life, how it came to be in the museum. I said, Ingram, man, he's his own little curse story. I think of him often whenever I read that because being squashed by an elephant is the closest you can get to a real life curse tale, I think.
Yeah. It definitely sounds like your beetle story as well. The beetle guy getting crushed by the train and then turning to beetle jam.
Yeah, I guess there weren't that many ways to kill people in the Victorian times, so everyone just gets squashed to jam by elephants, by trains. Well, maybe it's just me who's interested in like Gothic jam. Maybe that's my hobby. I'll have to bring out like a sub-line of products.
Well, it is the only sexy death. The alternative is like typhoid or like cholera or something, and nobody wants that.
Yeah, I guess it's one of them, isn't it? You can't really get killed in a dramatic car going off the road, like rock star death, can you? So it's very much like get tuberculosis and cough to death or get squashed by an elephant. Choose your Victorian glamour death, you know?
Yeah, definitely. So you mentioned earlier, and I have to bring it up because it's one of my pet interests. You mentioned how taste of the five senses, taste is the one that doesn't really pop up in books because people weren't eating mummies anymore. Please
Not
elaborate.
anymore. Okay, sure. So we're going to take it out of the Victorian period quickly. We're time traveling back to 1600-ish. And back then, people did eat mummies. So they would grind up mummy powder, and apparently they would mix it in with alcohol or chocolate. I'm not sure what option I would choose. They both sound disgusting texture-wise.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was said that it could cause probably could, to be honest, but it was meant to cure, not cause, a whole load of illnesses from epilepsy to rheumatism. And that was a really popular cure. However, as we enter a new age of science and reason, cannibalistic medicine falls out of favor, thank the Lord. And we move away from that. But people were apparently eating mummies up until around 1750. And in Germany, Germans, man, what are they doing? You could still buy it around the 1900s. So
wow.
That's a big, yeah, don't know why they were so late to let it go, but apparently that is the case. And I do think 1750 is a bit too close to 1880. People are still pretending this never happened. That is my theory. And that is why in these stories, there's not a lot about eating mummies or tasting mummies. I think they're still trying to distance themselves from that. But the Victorians do consume mummies in other ways. They use ground up mummy in paint. So there's a paint shade called Mummy Brown that is indeed made of mummies. And that was used often for dark skin texture or red hair. So if you look at those beautiful pre-Raphaelite paintings with that glossy red hair, the brown tones on that are often mummy brown. So they were still using mummies. And I think of this as a form of like neo-cannibalism, where they're still consuming the mummy, but they're not literally eating it. So they're putting a bit of distance between cannibalistic practices. But really, if you're consuming something and using it for your own gain, it's still a form of cannibalism. But it is a wild thing. And there's lots of, I guess that's another thing to disprove. There's lots of talk about eating mummies, but it happened not in the Victorian period. It was done by then. Blissfully, but it is a thing. People did eat mummies. Sadly, it's one of those weird things. Yeah, so breaking up the mummy's body for that was one thing.
And you were mentioning before that when it comes to female mummies, there's the theme of them like disappearing when people go and try and kiss them or something. Is this also playing into that where they're like, oh, we don't eat them, we don't even kiss them, they turn to dust?
Yeah, I do think it's kind of a way of sidestepping the necrophiliac elements of this. So they can fall in love with the mummy. They can reach out and be like, oh, she's so beautiful, I just want to be with her more than anything. But the moment we start to get into like icky, uncomfortable territory, they tend to dust. And that kind of settles the question. We don't have to worry about whether that dude was going to fuck the mummy or not because it's turned to dust. And there is a story called Iris the Mystery, which was written by a woman, interestingly, under a male pseudonym. And it's about a man who, a mummy comes back to life and he marries her and he like takes her around everywhere as his bride. And at the end, it transpires that she never came back to life. He's gone crazy and he's been carting around a desiccated, dried up female mummy in bridal gear with him everywhere. And that one, I think, is also highlighting that odd necrophiliac practice of being obsessed with the female mummy body. And this translates, I'm going dark into the horrible territory now, but this does happen in real life as well. There are archaeologists who keep records of female mummies that they discover, and they make comments on their pouting expressions and the shape of their breasts. And there's writings on how their breasts are flaccid and pendulous and things like this. And I'm like, well, yeah, they're mummified. But I just don't think I'd be particularly thrilled if in 5,000 years someone dug me up to comment on my lack of power, my dried up boobs. Um, but there is a lot of that. There's a lot of commenting on the body of the mummy. And to be fair, the same guy who wrote that, Elliot Smith, he also kept a collection of mummy penises in a drawer. So I don't think we should probably stress too much about what his opinion on anything was, really.
No, I'm just counting that guy.
No, no,
Not a fan.
no. And so you shouldn't be. One of them where apparently his family tried to hide it. Rightly so, because imagine going through your dad's drawer and finding their like mummy penis collection complete with annotated notes. Yeah, there's a book on Egyptomania that calls it a private and quirky form of Egyptomania. And I'm like, that is a really delicate way of putting that.
Yeah, at a certain point, it stops being an academic interest and it's just weird.
Yeah. I mean, there's space for all kinds of interests, but yeah, if you have to keep it in a drawer as a Victorian, you've gone too far. I'm like, these people keep stuff in bell jars. They're like collecting mummy feet and putting them on a desk. I'm like, if you have to keep your penis collection in a drawer, then you've definitely gone too far in 1909.
Definitely. It is funny to think of like, I wonder how many mummies we've lost to people eating them, using them as paint, or cutting them up into so many miscellaneous pieces that like they're scattered to the wind at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I dread to think. I think that there's probably a surprising amount of mummy foot paperweights lurking in attics all over England that you just wouldn't know what they were. You would just be like, oh, weird Halloween decoration. I'll just chuck this out. There's got to be. And I mean, even in like when they did, so Victorians were a popular form of entertainment, public mummy unwrappings. And when they unwrapped mummies in public, you would go to like a hall at University College London and you sit down for the evening and you watch someone unwrap a mummy. Apparently it takes ages because the bitumen that holds the bandages together is incredibly sticky. But when they were doing that, if they found any like swag in the bandages, like jewelry or keepsakes, that would be handed out like party favors. So I reckon there's quite a few amulets and pendulums and jewelry and all kinds of things that are just living in attics that people will never know came from a mummy unwrapping or grave robbing. There's got to be loads of it out there, right? And you just never know. You would just assume it was your mum's costume jewelry, but it's not.
Yeah. I know at least like we've heard of people, having skulls in their attics or in their homes for years, just thinking they're granddad's decorations from Halloween. And then at some point someone comes to the house and is like, mate, that's real. That's very real. You should not have that.
Yeah, I mean, there must be so much. And I just think about how popular Egyptian artifacts were and how widely spread they were. There must be quite a lot out there. I encourage everyone to go look in your attic and see what you can find. Who knows what will be in there? It's a truly terrifying thought.
Yeah, I kind of don't want to know what's in my hands. So, is there anything that we haven't touched on that you feel our listeners should know about your very interesting speciality here?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've traumatized everyone because unfortunately, the real life world of Victorian Egyptomania is just as gothic as the text. But I think one thing I haven't talked about and is often maybe slept on with these things is they have great illustrations. So many of these texts are illustrated, and often the images have little or not to do with the text. They've just given illustrator probably like a rough idea and they've gone full hog on it, and they'll have beautifully detailed backgrounds and they'll be great. So I really recommend that if you're having a dig along a reading list, that some of them are beautifully illustrated, and I would really recommend people look at that. I could write forever about the relationship between image and text, but so many of them do have great illustrations. The Beetle is one of them, by the way. But that would be something I recommend. If someone's going to dare to pick up one of these texts and read them, do have a look and see if there's any pictures to go with it, because they are great.
And if anyone is daring to read one of these, which would you recommend? What's a good toe in the water one?
Yeah. I've said the Beetle so much in this because it's quite weird. But if you do want more of a classic, mummy comes to get people, chases them, causes havoc, then Arthur Conan Doyle's Lot Number 249 is a really good entry point. That one's illustrated as well. In fact, the French version was done by an erotic illustrator. So the mummy's kind of sinewy and like muscular, um, in a strangely erotic way, but also horrifying. So yeah, I really recommend those two if you want to dip your toe in. And if you can't get involved at all with the Victorian language, then Anne Rice's Ramesses the Damned is as close as you're going to get without lengthy Victorian descriptions, because
I
they
might
love
have
to
to go
talk
for
about
that one.
nothing. Yeah, yeah. There's even a comic book version. If you're like, actually, Anne Rice is too wordy, I can't hack it. There's a graphic novel adaptation of it, which is much shorter. I think it may be out of print, but it's definitely available online illegally. That's how I read it. Don't grass me up. But yeah, and many of them are also, because they're Victorian and old, they're out of print and they're available for free on archive.org or the Internet Archive. So you can pick many of them up for free and read them online, which is lovely.
Well, there's one for everyone in the audience.
Yeah,
One for
yeah,
every
all
kind of
different
reader.
levels. And like, no matter
Perfect.
what you want, some of them are like 700 pages, or yeah, you can pick up a Anne Rice comic book and have a look that way. Either way, I'm unfussed as long as I get people to look at something, and then all is not lost.
So, if anyone wants to follow up more with you, where can they reach out?
So I have a website which is Dr. J Sullivan. I've got a contact form on there. I love reading your weird, wonderful comments and questions. So please fire away there. If you want to pick up my book, please feel free. It's an academic text, so it's ludicrously expensive, but there is a cheaper version coming out in paperback next year. And if you're a broke student who doesn't have academic access to it, give me a shout. Knowledge shouldn't be behind a paywall, so I can sort that. I'm also available on a weird triangle of social media platforms: LinkedIn, Blue Sky, and Instagram. So that Instagram is a beautiful blend of sort of academic work and personal stuff. So you'll have to slog through my poor camera photography as well to see what I'm up to. So I really recommend Blue Sky or LinkedIn for those. But yeah, all the usual places.
Perfect. And we will have that and your book all linked below in the show notes if
Lovely.
anyone
I
wants to
have
follow up there.
the display copy waiting right here. Look at that. Beautiful.
Beautiful
But
image
yeah,
on the
good
front
stuff.
as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
That's a lot number 249 erotic mummy illustration, as discussed 2 minutes ago. God bless it being out
Perfect.
of print so I can have the rights for free.
Love that. So thank you so much, Jay, for coming on to the show. This has been so fascinating, and I'm sure my readers would agree. I now need to go do some book shopping or illegal
Yeah,
comic book downloading and some out of print Googling.
all the good stuff.
So exactly. So thank you for being on, and thank you to the listeners for watching and listening. And I will see you all next week. Goodbye, guys.